I would invite you to just take a moment with me now to get into the consciousness, into the flow, into the awareness of things transcendent. We've all had a day of busyness and business in our several ways, our many diverse activities. And it's important that we make a transition, because there are certain values, certain attitudes, certain conditions that prevail during our day, in which, much as we would hope that we did not need to, yet we find that we must somehow go along with or acquiesce in or deal with. But we want to turn away for a moment to the realization that there is another world. For actually we live in two worlds. Not two worlds where one succeeds the other, but where one is the inner part of the other. The world of spirit, the world of divine law, the world of transcendent awareness. And the things we deal with in our time together tonight deal with the inner, with the principles, spiritual values. Not that they're impractical for the world outside. As a matter of fact, they become a tremendous influence by which we can deal effectively with the world outside. But they're on another level. And so we must turn within, acknowledge our oneness with the divine flow, commit ourselves to the realization of the truth that makes us free, and open our minds to an outpouring of insights, of feelings, of images, of directions that can enable us to go forth out into the world, seeing things in a little different way, dealing with things on a higher level of consciousness, and expressing ourselves at the deeper potential of our being. And so we remember all of this. We acknowledge it. And we commit ourselves to keep in this stream during this time tonight. And so be it. Right, we're considering another in our series, The 7 Main Aspects of Truth. Now, just to repeat a little introduction I gave last week from the standpoint that when we talk about the 7 main aspects of truth and we deal with 7 laws of metaphysics, that this is not to say that we are setting up here and now, once and for all time and all eternity, 7 fundamental laws of the whole metaphysical system. It's a very arbitrary selection. Any teacher would probably approach it from an entirely different point of view. The jewel of truth has many facets. And I know that many persons feel that it would be helpful and they'd feel very secure if someone could just once and for all give them all the laws of metaphysics. Well, perhaps if we're going to think of laws, there's really only one law, and the law is oneness, wholeness. All else is commentary on it. We see the jewel from many sides, and we get the brilliance of many facets. All of them may be very valid and very important, and we've simply selected 7 that we think of are extremely relevant and extremely important in our spiritual ongoing. And we would hope that you would take them in that context and keep the mind open and receptive, because at the end of the 7 main aspects of truth, maybe we'll come along with 14 more additional main aspects of truth. That's the process of teaching, and we might as well realize it. Last week we talked about the law of being. Today we're going to consider the law of unfoldment. One of the great problems of life today is that so many persons take themselves at face value. And by this I mean the person has never given too much consideration to anything in his life or in his own personality beyond the surface. He will say so often, well, after all, this is the way I am. What do you expect? Or Popeye might say it a little more classically, I am what I am, and that's all I am. In other words, the person then tends to simply make the best of the way he believes he was created. He may be a little bit discouraged about the fact that God didn't give him greater talents or abilities or make him as beautiful as somebody else, or God created him short and he'd like to be tall, or God created him tall and he'd like to be short. But he knows that ultimately he just simply makes the best of it, and that's the way it is. So he accepts himself at face value. Now, many people say that's just good practical philosophy of life. It is also very self-limiting. And as a result of this, so many persons do not really know themselves. And it's probably true of many of us that we do not know ourselves to the degree that we should. So that because of this lack of self-knowledge, there is a tendency, and it's more true in the lives of all of us than we may be aware of or that we'd like to admit to, that we tend sometimes to be reluctant to be alone with ourselves. Pascal wrote an essay entitled Diversion that talks about this, and he talks about how people plunge into the whirlpool of society chiefly to escape their own futility. He says, hence it comes that men so love noise and movement. Hence it comes that prison is so horrible a punishment. Hence it comes that the pleasure of solitude is a thing incomprehensible. And today in our society, and it is a growing tendency throughout the world, we have whole industries that are sort of like court jesters, which devise all sorts of ways to divert us, to keep us from thinking of self, that tell us just flip the television switch and we'll keep you entertained. We'll give you this fantasy and take you on this trip and we'll expose you to that kind of involvement and so forth. Or turn on the radio, you can have wall-to-wall news or music or whatever. Or read the magazine or read the newspaper. And so we have this whole process that basically is involved in seeking to entertain us and in many ways to divert us. Now, quite often a person might say, well, look, if I can't take myself at face value, then how do I accept myself? What am I then if I'm not what I appear to be? And a little child would probably say it best. He'd say, I'm God's possibility. And in a sense, this is pretty much what it amounts to. I am a spiritual being. I am a child of God in the process of becoming or manifesting this potential, or in the process of unfoldment. Professor Bateson of the British Society of Scientific Research, talking about the phenomena of gifted people and of the genius and so forth. And I think most of us have tended to assume, and it has been pretty much an accepted premise, that gifted people are just sort of born that way, that it's in their genes, that some people have blue eyes and some people have green eyes and some have brown eyes and some of them are geniuses. And we've kind of thought of it in that way. But Professor Bateson says that we're now finding beyond doubt that genius is due not so much to something added to the ordinary person, but to factors that in the normal person inhibit the development of these gifts. They are now, without doubt, to be looked upon as releases of powers normally suppressed. Now, this is one man's point of view, and obviously there would be a great debate of that in educational circles. But at least if we can take a phrase, I think it is a very interesting one, when he says, the release of powers normally suppressed. Because this would tend to apply to one like Jesus, especially as he obviously articulated it, not so much as traditional theology has looked upon him. In other words, he said that the things I do, you can do too if you have faith. He said that I'm no special person. He said, think not that I am come to destroy the law or the prophets. I am not come to destroy, but to fulfill. In other words, Jesus actually discovered the law of unfoldment, discovered the law of being, discovered this basic innateness of him, and discovered the process through which it can be released and unfolded, thus releasing powers normally suppressed to develop what we perhaps would call a spiritual genius. Now, the word fulfill is interesting. To fulfill anything is to bring it into complete realization, to bring into fulfillment or out picturing all that it potentially contains, to bring out its possibilities. This would be fulfilling anything or fulfillment. Now, if we look at man as a whole, civilization as a whole, considering, without citing certain cultures today as being more developed than others, but thinking of the race of man throughout the world as a norm, which is very hard to do, the laws of nature today for mankind are exactly the same as they were back in the days of the cave dwellers. And that goes a long time back, because some of you may have read the write-up in the Times this morning about some of the recently discoveries in archaeology that indicate that man in a somewhat similar physical state and brain structure and so forth was living on the earth, I think it said 3.5 billion years ago. So that's a long time. But the laws of nature are exactly the same today as they were in those early days, whenever that was. But these early forebears brought out only a fraction of possibilities and released only a very small part of the powers, thus suppressing much of the tremendous potentiality. Now again, from an anthropological point of view, there may be some debate about this. But the thing is, today, obviously, we've released a great deal more of the powers and possibilities, whether we want to consider the factor of evolution or not, but perhaps evolution is related to what we're talking about as unfoldment. Obviously, most of us are aware of the fact, because if we look farther in the newspapers of today or any other day, we know that we've only scratched the surface of releasing our potentialities. So we continue to advance. Evolution is not a historical fact. It's a condition that goes on and on and on. And we advance not by contradicting the law, not by breaking laws that enable us to do more things, but by fulfilling law which has always been a part of life itself. And thus we could say that Jesus did what he did. Any great innovator or inventor or researcher or discoverer did what he did, not by breaking law, but by realizing the potential of the law, by releasing powers normally suppressed. So the fundamental here is that there is no special law for anyone. There's no special law for a Jesus any more than there's a special law for, say, a Thomas Edison when he develops a telephone, or a special law for a discoverer who moves around the world against all the tradition that the world is flat. There is no special law for anyone. But anyone can specialize the law by using it with a fuller understanding. And this essentially is what Jesus is all about. It's what truth is all about. It's what metaphysics is all about. It's not finding some special law or some special pipeline to God, but it's understanding the law and specializing the law by using it with a fuller understanding of what life is all about. Now, we talked a little bit about the law of being last week, and this was simply the idea that you are a divine idea in infinite mind. The Christ of you is what we call being, capital B-E-I-N-G, being, capital B-E-I-N-G, being. You are the infinite activity of God in the process of being you. Being you. And we use the childish illustration that you are a smile on the face of God to try to to get the realization that you are that activity expressing as you, that there's no separation. Jesus then discovered this process of the law of unfoldment, which we could refer to as spiritual evolution. Now, there is obviously a great disparity between the ideal person that God creates, the Christ of you, and the manifest person that some people would say I'm stuck with. There's a great disparity between that. We talk about the absolute idea of perfection, the idea of the Christ in you, but obviously we all know that we have a long way to go in actually fulfilling it and outpicturing it. So there's a great disparity between these two poles. Now, back in the early days of Christianity, the theologians puzzled over this, and they came up with two fundamental, very deeply influential theological traditions. One was the idea of original sin, the idea that man, as the psalmist says, was shapen in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me, which established once and for all in the Christian tradition that man comes into the world through the process of sin, and so he's a sinner. And all he can hope for is that through salvation he can ultimately become a good sinner, but he'll always be a sinner. This makes the tremendous separation, which the theologians were certainly interested in doing, between the person and Jesus. Because the other great principle that the theologians established was the idea of the divinity of Jesus, that Jesus was not a man at all, that he was God wearing the clothing of man for a while to lead man into higher dimensions of life. So that it is here then that Christianity, in my estimation, has failed totally to understand the mission of Jesus, missing the great lesson, which is so important to every person, and that is the law of unfoldment. Without the realization of the law of unfoldment, a person may hope for betterment in his life, but he will never really expect it. And he will never actually do anything to fulfill it, because if God wanted me any different, he'd make me that way. And so he, in a sense, he blocks the process of unfoldment because he doesn't accept this as a fundamental law of life. So I want to think a little bit about that tonight, because you see, it's important that we understand that Jesus enters into this picture not as God, but as man in the process of becoming God, or of God becoming man at the higher level of evolution, demonstrating what all persons must achieve, underline must, not can achieve, not that perhaps someday, if we're good, we may achieve, but that every person must achieve. Now that's the fundamental. You see, we're not talking about an ideal of unfoldment. We're talking about a law of unfoldment. In other words, we may wander in the far country, and much of our lives, figuratively, is spent in the far country. But ultimately, we must come to ourselves and arise and go on to the Father. We must ultimately grow, unfold, so that the without may become as the within. You may recall the disciples asked Jesus, when shall the kingdom come? They were very curious about this and very concerned with it, because they were completely into the belief, as much of our Christian theology has been into the belief, that Jesus had really come to set up a worldly kingdom. And it was going to be a political kingdom. And so they all thought that they were going to have special positions of favoritism as the lieutenants of the king, as they assumed Jesus was going to be. And so they wondered when it's going to happen. When will the kingdom come? It was a very important part of early Christianity, that idea of the coming of the kingdom. And it has become an important part of a lot of our fundamentalist Christianity even today. And Jesus said, seemingly very cryptically, but yet very metaphysical and very important, he said, the kingdom will come when the without is as the within. I remember another time he said that the kingdom of heaven or the kingdom of God cometh not with observation, is not here or there, it's not a place, it's not a time. Lo, the kingdom of God is within you. The kingdom then is the within. It's the transcendent part of man, the divine ideal, the Christ of you. It's God expressing as you, being you, at the higher level of your being. When shall it come? When the without becomes as the within, indicating a process of unfoldment, a process of expression. Jesus also said, "Be ye perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect." He didn't say, well, some of you perhaps are going to do very well in this experience, and we will grade you accordingly, and some of you will get A's and B's and C's and D's. Some of you will fail, but there probably will be one or two of you who will get the A plus and get the wings, and you will make it. He didn't say that at all. He said, blanket statement, "Be ye perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect." In other words, it is an ultimate which every person must ultimately express and experience. Now, obviously, we know that we all have a long way to go. And there's no point in assuming that just by learning a few truths and affirming a few statements of truth that we're suddenly going to sprout wings and fly off into the heavens. We have a long way to go. And when we understand, as I'm sure most of us are trying to understand, life in an eternal context beyond the limitations of a span of life that begins with birth and ends with death, that there's eons of time to achieve it, that there is an ultimate that may well be beyond what we call this particular span of life. But that does not mean that we should sit down and simply relax and say, oh, well, it'll happen sometime, but let's have fun now. It simply means that the idea of unfoldment is not an option, it's a must. This is the one fundamental law, that there's no possible way that we can escape the ultimate evolution of that which is involved. The time involved may vary tremendously. In other words, like the prodigal son, he may say, look, don't give me any of that, give me what's mine, I'm going out and have a good time. And so he did. But ultimately, he came to himself. Now, one of the things we do not understand about the parable is we think that this is talking about a sort of a figurative indication of God and man, and we think of it in terms of time, because it seems like he went out maybe for a few days or a few weeks, and then eventually he came home and all was well. But it can't be considered in terms of time, but in terms of depth. When he came to himself and said, I will arise and go unto the Father. Actually, this might have been, if you're going to think of it beyond the time frame and beyond the limitation of one particular lifetime, it might have been many, many incarnations of life between the time he came to himself and the time he came back home. You see, we're indicating a process here that is not in any way linked with something that happens in the kind of consciousness that we can think of it as tomorrow or the next day or next week or next year. But the important thing is that even though we wander in the far country, even though we become locked into limited experiences and are in many ways so involved in the acquisitional stage of life and in the materialistic stage of life, ultimately there must come an awakening where we say, but I know that I am more than this. And it may be progressive. We may do it many times over. We may, in many experiences in our lives, have that sense that I know that this is not the answer, and I'm going to look to a higher awareness of my experience. But there's no choice in the matter. We can choose how long we block the process, and we can sometimes frustrate it for a long period of time, but we cannot ultimately repress or limit or restrict the unfolding process of the divine within ourselves. It's fundamental law. So in our conscious human self, we're on the pathway of our own evolution. And if we simply accept ourselves at face value, as we said in the beginning, then we move horizontally through life. And this is our far country. You see, the far country is not necessarily doing something illegal or immoral or even wasteful. The far country is simply living in a horizontal experience where we accept ourselves as face value. Well, this is my life. What are you going to do? You go to work, you eat, you sleep, you make a few dollars. You hope that someday you can get ahead enough so that you can buy a little bungalow in Florida and spend your waning days, and that's the way life is. And that's the far country, because it's living superficially. It's like a water strider that floats along on the surface of the pool, but never ever breaks the surface of the water, never ever knows anything beneath it. So that the coming to yourself is coming to the awareness that even though I am doing the things I do out here in life, yet there is a deeper dimension of it all, because there's a deeper dimension of myself. There are other things than simply sense gratification or seeking pleasure and making happiness and security the goals of experience. The need to grow as a person, the need to expand our awareness of ourselves so that we can deal with life at a deeper and deeper, or if you will, a higher and higher level of consciousness. So that the aim of evolution, and I don't care whether you're talking about literal evolution or spiritual evolution, the aim of evolution is to produce the person who completely manifests the inner life of spirit. Now, Jesus constantly urged people, figuratively and literally, to turn away from the world-centered life, to seek the Christ-centered pathway of growth and unfoldment. And he proved the effectiveness of this kind of life. And he said, I do nothing of myself, but as my Father taught me, I speak these things. It's not just something that comes off the top of my head. It's not just an intellectual thing, but I listen. In other words, the need here is to listen to the movement of mind, to listen deep within ourselves and find an inner guidance, an inner direction, an inner flow of inspiration and guidance, which is the basis of spiritual evolution. And under the law of unfoldment, therefore, man is born to greatness as the sparks fly upward. Or as Henri Bergson would say, an intelligent being carries within him the wherewithal to surpass himself. The intelligent being carries within him the wherewithal to surpass himself. Now, in the human consciousness, taking life ourselves at face value, every time we run up against an obstacle, we say, well, that's the end of that. It was a nice try, you see. Or if we come up against certain handicaps or limitations of consciousness or personality within ourselves that tend to impede us, quite often the person who accepts himself at face value will say, well, I would like to be more and do more, but what are you going to do? This is the way I was made. This is the way I've always been. But an intelligent being carries within him the wherewithal to surpass himself, always. So that when one really gets a hold of this idea, he would never allow himself to be locked into a position, say a position of retirement, or a position where he's been pushed aside by life, where he says, well, my life is over. There's nothing more for me to do. Because he knows that as long as you have a breath in your body at all, and there's a beat of your heart, you have within you the capacity to surpass yourself. Even if it is expanding your mind intellectually, expanding your experience, broadening your ways of creativity and of service and so forth, you always have the ability to surpass yourself. And that's true spiritually. Quite often people say, well, I've studied truth for a good while, and I guess I've sort of reached my peak. That's sad. Because there isn't any peak. There's no place where suddenly you've made it. In fact, you look very carefully at the story of Jesus, you find that on the one occasion he said, there are things to say and things to tell you that I can't even express, which seems to indicate to me that when he achieved that state of seeming graduation from this particular experience or plane of life, that he was just moving on to the next one. And there are all those esoteric teachings that talk about many, many levels and many, many other areas of unfoldment. It's all very good and all very interesting, and I'm sure much of it is very valid, though I think sometimes the writers get carried away. But the important thing is not to get locked into all those next stages that we're going to be involved in, but simply to know that it goes on and on and on and on. I think quite often the student of truth becomes a little bit discouraged. Quite often one says, but, I've been trying and working and overcoming and treating and demonstrating and working at changing and growth and unfoldment all my life. Don't you suppose that sometime I would get to the place where I could just kind of heave a sigh and say, well, I've made it? Well, yeah, if that's what you want. That's what death is. If you're looking for that out, why, you have a rest for a while, but I'm sure that's not the end of it all. It goes on and on. So it's important then to overcome the resistance of it. All fatigue basically is related to resistance. It's true in your work. If you come home from work tired every night, it's not that they're working you too much. You may have thought that, and you may have tried to impress the boss that he's working you too hard. But basically the reason you're tired is because you're unhappy, because you're resistant. You may feel he's not paying you enough. You may feel that nobody appreciates you. That's the reason you get exhausted. And all the way through our life, if we get a sense of burden in terms of this whole spiritual unfoldment process, it's because we're resisting it. Accept it as the very joy of life, as the meaning of life. The only meaning that life has is growth. Some people think that if you find meaning, that suddenly you've found the kingdom. And a lot of people are constantly looking for a job that is meaningful. I hear this all the time. A person says, I just don't, my job isn't interesting. I don't find any meaning in my job at all, so I'm trying to find a job that has more meaning. And, of course, he's usually concerned with the outward evidence of glamour and sophistication, and usually with the money, too, obviously. And because usually money, he says, money means everything, so if I have a lot of money in my job, it's going to mean that my job has meaning. It doesn't work out that way. The fact is, no job has meaning. No experience has meaning. Nothing that we can do in life or that life can do for us can establish a meaningful existence. Meaning is only to be found in yourself, nowhere else. And you only find meaning within yourself. It's not something you find in some little pocket back in your consciousness, or you discover some little closet in the inner kingdom, but you find meaning in yourself when you suddenly discover that life is a constant unfolding process. And when you realize from day to day that you're in the process of growth and unfoldment, then life has meaning. Kind of strange, isn't it? Because it isn't any sudden degree you're going to get. It's not something that happens to make it all kind of exciting. It's just the awareness, the complete conviction that I'm in the flow of overcoming. And the interesting thing then is that you come to realize that, that we not only know that we have the potential for growth and betterment, but we expect growth, we insist on growth, we demand growth in every experience. As Jacob said after wrestling all night with the angel in this figurative illustration, I will not let thee go except thou bless me. That I know that there is good in every experience, and that's what life is all about. You know, we sometimes think that, why do I have to have this? I have headaches, I have challenges, I have people picking on me, I have unemployment to deal with, I have financial problems. Oh, why do we have to have all these things to go through? Well, if we didn't have those to go through, then we would have to experience something else to go through, and we go through and go through and go through until we grow through. Because life is growth, life is unfoldment, that's what it's all about. So every challenge that comes along, no matter what it is, you can put it off, you can run away from it sometimes for a while. You know, you can say, I don't like my job, I run away and find another one, but sometimes it's not easy to get another one, so you can't run too far. But the point is, the student of truth who realizes the process of unfoldment and knows that he ultimately must unfold in the outer that which is within, he sees every challenge, every experience, every heartache, every slap in the face, literally and figuratively, every loss, every unfortunate circumstance, he sees it all as an opportunity to grow. So he says, well, here it is. This is my next test. That's what I'm looking for. I'm studying truth. So I'm seeking to find a greater awareness of my life, a greater meaning in life, to give a greater flow of the unfolding process of the divine within me. So this is my test. Praise God for it. Now let's get at it, you see. And the moment he overcomes the resistance of it, which is the biggest thing, the moment he stops saying, oh, why do I have to do it? Why are they picking on me? And simply rolls up his sleeves and says, nothing could come to me but that somehow I have within me the potential God-given to rise above it, to solve it, and to grow through it. Most of the problem is already defeated right there. The rest of it becomes joy, becomes happy experiences, because they're growing experiences. One can sometimes find a greater sense of meaning in unemployment than he can in a job. Now you may question that. Sometimes a person can find greater meaning in sickness than he can in health. Because the job and the health we can very easily take for granted. We can very easily wander in the far country. We can very easily just live superficially, like the water strider skidding around on the top of the pool without ever going beneath it. But once the unemployment, once the financial difficulty, once the crisis, once the sickness, something has to change. You must do something. And you may still skitter about, but in time you don't skate too far on the water, you see. If you're not as strong as you were, and if you don't have as much money as you have, you're kind of curtailed. And eventually you find it kind of closing in on you until ultimately you must say, I guess the next step must be within. And at that point, we have the greatest possibility for growth staring us right in the face if we don't miss the appointment. Sometimes we do. Sometimes we just sit down and cry. But that's the time to say, okay, this is what it's all about. And I'm not going to let this thing go until I find growth in it. I'm going to grow through this experience. And it's more important to grow through, we'll put it this way, it's more important to grow through an experience of unemployment than it is to get another job quickly without having to go through any inner process of growth. It's more important to grow through an experience of illness than have somebody come along and give you a miracle pill to stop your headache so you can go about your business again and go skittering on the pond some more. And that may be shocking in a way, but the important thing is to know that the law of unfoldment is what life is all about. When we understand that, then we're going to insist on growth and betterment regardless of what may happen. Many persons have found themselves for the first time in tragedy, in failure, in tremendous chaotic financial conditions. Many have found themselves for the first time after going through a process in the clutches of alcoholism or addiction of one kind or another. Often persons have found themselves for the first time in a very literal experience in the far country, perhaps in a long stretch in the penitentiary. And it's always interesting, I think, to read or to hear that which has happened to the person. How suddenly, when he comes to the end of his rope, when he's gone as far as he can go, when he's defeated and everything is lost, when suddenly he realizes that he's on the threshold of the greatest gain of his life. And it's not just a healing of the problem. It's not just getting his money back. It's not just solving the addiction. It's not just suddenly getting a healing. But it's getting the awakening within, which was what the problem was all about. You see? And it's beautiful to see this happen. There's a story that I just love of a man who early along in life, probably in part because of circumstances and the kind of neighborhood he grew up in and the various relationships he had, he got off the path early. He spent much of his early life on the shady side of the law, and it could be said that he went to a school of higher education of how to be an expert criminal, and he succeeded and did his postgraduate work in the penitentiary. And it's a story that you can read about over and over and over again. And so here he was, after committing almost every crime in the book, with a long stretch ahead of him, and very little hope for him, according to taking oneself at face value. But during this experience, somehow there was a coming to himself. Now this often happens. We don't always hear about it. And perhaps we should hear about it more. But he came to himself, and he began to experience a whole new inner flow and a whole new perspective of life, and he saw things differently. He changed. He began to write poetry. It wasn't classic poetry. I think it's very interesting, especially because of the way it was written and because of the ideas it articulates. It's something that I'm sure you and I can identify with. At least I love it. And I'd like to read a poem that this man wrote. I think it is a poem that I've often read and said, I wish I could write that. But most importantly, a poem that makes me rejoice in what happened to the person that enabled this particular poetic flow to express. It goes like this. Now, mind you, this man wrote this in the penitentiary, where he had little hope at that time. He said, I am not the brood of the dust and sod, nor a shuttled thread in the loom of fate, but a child divine of the living God, with eternity for my life's estate. I am not the sport of a cosmic night, nor a thing of chance that has grown to man, but a deathless soul on my upward flight, and my Father's heir in his wondrous plan. As I weigh the suns on the rim of space, who can dare to doubt of my destiny? Who can fence my feet within time and place as I search the worlds of infinity. I am man, the Son of the One Most High. I am man, the one with the life divine. I am Lord of earth and of sea and sky, and behold, the powers of heaven are mine. I am man the chosen, and man the free, and it matters not what I may have been, for I walk erect through eternity to the far-off goal that is yet unseen. With unswerving faith in the coming day, I have turned my course from the things of time, and with Jesus, my brother, to point the way, I have found my place in the life sublime. As I said, these words were written in the penitentiary at a time when there was little hope for release. Obviously, it opened a whole new way of life for him. Ultimately, he was pardoned and released and came back to New York City, where he had a very successful career in business under another name. But the important thing is that the most dynamic point in that man's life, the most significant point in his life, was not a time before he got into this limited experience of life, and not the fact that ultimately he got out of it. But the most significant, the most dynamic time in his life was when he was right there pacing the floor in the cell of the penitentiary. I will not let thee go except thou bless me. I'm not saying we should all go to penitentiaries in order to get help. But as Star Daly, another one who went through a similar type of experience, used to say that we all live behind prison walls. They're just made differently. And we are serving sentences for different reasons that are self-imposed. And we all need to find release from the blocks of our own inner consciousness so that we can let the process of growth go on. So I think then that it's so important that we begin to realize that very few people have discovered the greater possibilities of real existence. And that's the thing that we're about in our study of truth. So often a person has been taught to think that to make a fortune or to make a name for himself are the only things that are worthwhile in life. And if he doesn't seemingly have the talent for these, then perhaps he feels there's nothing left but simply to exist. Yet he probably has within him the inklings or the feelings of ambition, the urge for more, and perhaps also an occasional little glimpse, maybe that he doesn't understand, of his ideal self. So mere existence never really satisfies. There are very few people who can just exist in life and be happy with it. So the result is unhappiness and dissatisfaction. Many persons who have evaluated life purely in terms of money, in terms of success, in terms of name and fame, find life to be a barren waste. Not because it is a barren waste, but because they just haven't found meaning. And the quest for success, under what I refer to often as the success syndrome, which is a tremendous influence in our society, the quest for success is often an escape from meaninglessness. The person who is constantly driving up the ladder of success. It doesn't mean that this is always true. It doesn't mean that every successful person is a person who is empty. You can't evaluate, you can't judge by another person, because the other side of it is seek first the kingdom and all these things shall be added. So a person can be very successful and have it as a result of the added process of his inner awareness of the flow of life. But in so many cases, this constant frantic urge for success is an escape, a running away from a meaningless existence, you see. So the point is, we find if we are limiting the growth process within ourselves, that we're going to experience trouble of many kinds. When we depend on things to entertain us, to divert us, things to satisfy us, things to fulfill us, then we tend ultimately to experience emptiness. And the goal, the need, is to realize that growth, unfoldment is what life is all about, and to work constantly, as Ira Progoff would say, to reactivate the process of growth. To know that there's something more to live for than materiality, even than relationships. Something more to live for than the acquisition of what the world can offer. and to come to the realization that the great goal of life is not to live for anything, but to live from something. And to know that the from is the depth within ourself. It's like the little child would say, after all, I'm all I've got. The important thing is you are all you've got, and as the facetious slogan puts it, you can't take it with you. You can't take with you anything else that you have, because all you are and all you have is this infinite process of the divine idea expressing through you. And that's what life is all about. And it must express through you. You must ultimately release and let go the outer things and let the divine process flow. And when you do, when you realize this, when you decentralize your thought from the things or the goals or the objectives or the persons or the money and all the things out here that are so very attractive, when you decenter your consciousness from that and center your thought in the depth within yourself and realize that life is a process of the flow from within, then beautifully all these things are added. So it doesn't mean pulling yourself out of the world and going to live in a cave, but it means to have your focus correct so that you know that the goal of life is not to change things out here, not to amass things out here, but rather to see things out here from a perspective of your own relationship to the divine flow. Now, I'd like us to take a few moments, if you will. We have a few moments. I would like you now to join with me in a time of quiet reflection, perhaps to visualize something. Just get very still and relaxed. And I want you to establish first a few things that sort of satisfy the human instincts. You might just reach down and feel the seat under you, and just assure yourself that it's there. So you're sitting comfortable. And kind of move your feet a little bit on the floor and kind of reassure yourself that your feet are on the floor and you have an earth beneath you. And even though you've been sitting for a while in an auditorium that perhaps is not as beautifully circulated as we would like, yet there's air enough here for you. And whether or not you've had your supper yet tonight or whether you're hungry, you're not that hungry, and you're not going to starve. And you're surrounded not by insecure situations, but by people with whom you can feel secure, people who are following the same ideals as you. So you're with friends, you're in a friendly environment, and for a few moments at least, you're quietly separated from the humdrum and the tension and the pressure of the world out there. So with all of that as sort of a pre-awareness, kind of think of the illustration of a person dangling at the end of a rope. A person who is not aware where the floor is. And he's holding on for dear life. And people around him might say, when he feels tense, get a grip on yourself. Get a new hold on life. So always there's this holding on, hanging on for dear life. So just get the sense for a moment, if you will, of letting go. And lo and behold, you fall just a few inches into a very soft, cushioned experience. And you fall gracefully and comfortably into the cushion. And it feels so good. And suddenly you realize, why was I so anxious? Why so troubled? Why was I holding on so long? So in consciousness now, in imagination, as you rest comfortably and quietly, easily and peacefully in this cushioned experience, just for a moment, ask yourself the question, why am I here? What is life all about? Where am I going? What's the meaning of it all? You're not disheartened. You're not uncomfortable. Yet for a moment there are no problems, there are no concerns. But there comes into the consciousness that sense that I must be creative. I must be involved. And even as the question runs through the mind, get the sense that there is kind of a little bubbling, gurgling within you. And then you realize that this is the inner flow. And it suddenly breaks forth, streaming into you a beautiful realization of love. And it's so beautiful, it's so wonderful. Maybe you've never before in your life felt loved as you do right now. Under the experience of that bubbling, gurgling flow of love coming from within you. And again, you would just kind of want to hold on to it and bask in it and experience it. But then there comes into your consciousness the realization that life is more than that. And so you let it flow out, and you let it radiate out. Not consciously singling out persons to love, but just loving. Loving all the world. And suddenly it feels good. And suddenly your life has meaning. And again, thinking of yourself as basking in the comfort of the soft, cushioned experience, and another bubbling within you. A bubbling of creativity. And suddenly you feel so creative. You feel that your mind is flowing with ideas. You have so many fantastic things come through you. Your fingertips fairly tingle with creativity. And it feels good. But then again, there's a sense there must be something more. And so you let go and let this creativity flow out through you to direct your hands and direct your footsteps. So that suddenly the creativity flows from your hands in your work, that you work more creatively, that you express new ideas. You have a sense of givingness about you. Wherever you are, you're giving, creating, serving. And there's no thought of depletion because it's a bubbling stream that flows through you. And it feels so good. And suddenly your life has meaning, even in the same places where before you felt it was all meaningless. So again, thinking of yourself sitting comfortably in this cushioned experience, relaxed and peaceful, the bubbling within you. And suddenly there flows forth within you spiritual awareness, a feeling of your oneness with truth. It feels so good. It's so revealing. You feel yourself bathed in light. And yet suddenly there's a restlessness. And you know that light cannot be contained. And so you just look out in the world around you. And light flows forth. Light that goes out not with any thought of return, but just goes out as an influence. It enables you to see your loved ones, your family, your friends, to see your work, to see the world, to see all the passing parade of experiences and phenomena, to see them all in a new illumined sense. And it feels so good. And suddenly life has meaning. So again, you're seated comfortably on the cushioned experience. And now you know the process of unfoldment. And you know that it's not really something to grow to or something to achieve or somewhere to engage in some new activity, but it's just to know that right where you are within yourself, there is that point where you are always in the experience of oneness. If you can just let go and let God be God in you. And then there comes an awareness. Much as you would want to, you cannot sit there for long. Comfortable as it is, peaceful as it is, secure as you feel, you know you must be up and doing. But you make the commitment right here that you will never forget, wherever you are, whatever you're doing, whatever the challenges, whatever the blessings, whatever the relationships, that you are always one with that inner experience, that depth. And suddenly you know what Jesus meant when he said, "Take my yoke upon you, for my burden is easy, my load is light." And you know that yoke or that yoga refers to oneness. It refers to the cushions of the inner experience, where it's always soft and relaxing and peaceful. And with that image in your consciousness and that awareness, then you go into your life, into your work, into your relationships, possibly facing the same things as before, but now with a new incentive, with a new resource, with a new non-resistance, with new creativity, with new love, with a new dimension, and with a new sense of meaning. Now, in any way that feels right to you according to where you are in consciousness, perhaps you'd just like to say, "Thank you, Father," or "I'm grateful," or just let your heart well up in a feeling of gratitude. And so be it.